What happens when a prison reform panel becomes a performative stall tactic? In this episode, we break down why the Oregon Justice Resource Center made the difficult decision to step away from Governor Kotek's advisory panel on women's prison reform. After 2 years of ignored recommendations, performative meetings, and worsening conditions inside Coffee Creek, we ask, is Oregon really serious about change or just managing the optics? Coming up next on Trailblazing Justice. This is Trailblazing Justice, episode 70, recorded Thursday, June 26, 2025. Governor Kotek's GIPA advisory panel, performative process without substance. It's time for Trailblazing Justice, the weekly podcast where we discuss civil and criminal rights in Oregon and beyond. Trailblazing Justice is a production of the Oregon Justice Resource Center. And here's Bobbin.
Welcome back to another episode of Trailblazing Justice. I'm Bobbin Singh, the Executive Director of the Oregon Justice Resource Center. And I'm back with Zach Winston, our Director of Policy and Outreach, and Julia Yoshimoto, the Director of our Women's Justice Project and Senior Advisor to the organization. We're back after a week off. We had done a lot of recordings and decided to just take a week off, but we're going to pick back up and jump back into the different sort of paths or different kind of recording trajectories that we have. So we're back talking about some substantive policy and criminal justice issues today. We'll be talking about the GIPA and why we stepped off of that, the GIPA Advisory Committee, and then we will have a follow-up on our solitary podcast recordings. That'll be hopefully in the next week or two. And then we'll be back with Steve next week with another episode of Waxing Confidential to talk about what's going on federally and with the Trump administration and its impact on Oregon and just generally on civil rights. So Zach, Julia, I know there's been some other things percolating before we jump into the GIPA bill with the legislative session. It's been kind of a busy week. You want to give an update or just like an overview of this drone bill that's been sort of, it feels like it would just never go away, but the Oregon legislature and their wisdom decided to introduce a bill that would actually expand law enforcement power and the use of warrantless drones. Do you want to talk a little bit about it and give us like what happened in the past couple of weeks?
Yeah, happy to. It's so the bill we're talking about, if anyone wants to track the history of it, is Senate Bill 238. And it's a drone bill. We call it the drone bill. It's essentially, so current law allows for law enforcement to use drones either with a warrant, right, which has to go through the judicial process, or without a warrant in certain situations like search and rescue operations, investigating a crime or accident scene, or with the consent of private property owner, or like exigent circumstances, right? So, and which generally is pretty broad exception here, broad exception in the Fourth Amendment. So what 238 would do would be to significantly expand the drone use by law enforcement in Oregon, and the proponents of the bill are, I think it's something like the Law Enforcement Drone Association or something like that, which is led by some chiefs of police.
And from Oregon.
In Oregon. I don't know if it's an Oregon specific or if it's like national and just led by Oregon.
I got to say, it's kind of a bizarre association. Yeah,
it's an interesting niche. And so what we saw this as is just a clear attempt by law enforcement to evade judicial authority, right? Because they're saying we want to be able to use this in all these different circumstances and not have to get a warrant, right? That's essentially the basis of the bill, is to try to get rid of the warrant requirement, because the warrant requirement means that they have to go to a judge and they have to apply for a warrant, and then that's public record. It's going to be, recorded. It's going to be examined. It's going to be, collected for data. There's all sorts of reasons that we need this judicial oversight, and they clearly just don't want to deal with that. They kept giving examples of like why they need this bill, and all the examples, a lot of the opponents of the bill kept saying, no, you can pretty much probably do what you're saying you want to do, but we know what you actually want to do, right? Which I can get to a little bit later about our concerns about it. But like, that was the frustration here, was that like they have current law allows them to do what they say they want to be doing. And so we just believed it was an attempt to evade judicial authority and oversight. We believed it went against the fundamental structure of a democracy. Um, and then what really concerns us is the potential constitutional rights issues, privacy, free speech, and the ways in which they could use the drones to basically surveil Oregonians without a warrant. Drones are small enough that you can't actually see if they put like a sticker that says, Portland Police Bureau or
They're
something.
gonna have like the little blue light.
No, I don't think they were intending to do that. And so you would never really know if it's the police, if it's a private, citizen that's doing it. You just wouldn't know. And we could see where they were going to do this. I mean, this happened in other places, right? So I'm located in New York. I've seen this at No Kings protests in New York. They've been using drones. They've used drones over other protests to basically just surveil as much as they want.
Yeah, I mean, we saw it when we were in Hawaii at the Honolulu No Kinks. There was a drone just hovering above, and we assumed it was law enforcement drone, but it could have been any drone. Like we didn't know, to your point.
Right, which is one of the concerns. There are other concerns, constitutional concerns, with just the police basically having carte blanche to just fly drones over properties. Now, they'll say they tried to put safeguards in the bill. We didn't feel the safeguards were sufficient to alleviate any of our concerns. And I think just to set up what the history is on this, I think so. The bill sailed through the Senate. It didn't necessarily get. You have to understand there's about 3,000 bills or something like that filed in the long sessions. And so a lot of and there's a robust but very few amount of organizations that are really dug in and trying to identify all these what I call bad bills that are out there, and then you kind of have to triage which are the bad bills that you actually can spend time and resources on, in addition to running affirmative bills. And one of our partners on that a lot of times is ACLU of Oregon, and identifying bills for them that we think are concerning. They identify bills for us that we think are concerning. And this was but this kind of, I wouldn't say slipped through the net. We saw it, but it didn't necessarily make it to the top of the list because we were not entirely sure that it would make it. Well, it got through the Senate pretty quickly. And then once it got over to the House, we were able to mobilize a pretty nice coalition of organizations that were in opposition to it. And that then kicked off just a bunch of, we had to work quickly. It went to the House Judiciary, where we were able to, and I know ACLU Oregon did a ton of work on this as well. But we had Kyle Hedquist, one of our policy associates, down there every single day with ACLU, taking meetings on his own. We ran a ton of comms on this, but so we were able to get the House Judiciary to back off a vote for it. And they ended up voting to move it to rules. So the important, maybe too much in the weeds, so Bob and tell me to stop. But essentially, if you move it to rules, you avoid any deadline issues. So when it's in House Judiciary, you have these deadlines you have to meet, or a bill procedurally dies. And to avoid that, you could send it to rules, which is a committee that doesn't necessarily play by the rules. And so that was the intent, was to skirt that. And so it got voted out, although two legislators voted in opposition to that, to move it to rules, which is relatively rare to see. It's a courtesy generally, or some unwritten etiquette that they like to throw out there, but whatever. We loved to see the legislators. I think it was Rep. Chaichi and Rep. Tran. So anyway, the bill goes to rules. We then work on talking to legislators in the House at large, but also specifically with the House Rules Committee members. And we work really hard to just educate them on what the bill is, what our concerns are, and why we don't believe that this is a good bill, and why we believe it will do harm to Oregonians, and that and then least of all, but still an issue, is the process that the bill is taken, which has not allowed for any community feedback on it. So it seemed like the bill wasn't going to move for a little bit. This is the last week of session. I was really excited to just kind of watch the session and monitor it. And, we still have a bill that's alive. And so anyway, found out that the bill, so we there was a hearing in House Rules, and the coalition turned out a ton of testimony. I think it was like over 1,000 pieces of testimony submitted, where like 17, can't remember the exact number, 17 or something was in favor of the bill, and everything else was opposition to the bill. So why, tons and tons of opposition testimony, and that's, I think, scared them. And so what we ended up seeing is there was another bill in House Rules, SB, I think it was 1125, which dealt with drones as well. So the relating to clause was close enough that they could kind of introduce an amendment to slide in the language from SB 238, which is, for those paying attention, the drone bill. And so that was our concern, was that they were going to potentially do that. Well, they did it. And so then we had to mobilize, and they did it. And then they scheduled a work session, which is when they vote on it. They introduced the amendment like 12 hours before the work session was supposed to happen or something like that. And so there wasn't much time. And again, partners at ACLU Oregon and other coalition partners and us, we all responded to it. And we're able to communicate our concern and frustration with that part of the process. And ultimately, it didn't. The amendment didn't get a vote. The bill, SB 1125, a different amendment that didn't have that drone bill language in it, that passed out of the committee, but they did not adopt the amendment. So victory. I don't want to. It's not over until the session is officially over, which is either going to be Friday, Saturday, or Sunday. But yeah. So although that may have already happened by the time this comes out, but yeah. So that's where we're at, Bob. And that is, but it's been a success. It's been nice to see. It looks like it's going to be a success. It's been nice to see just the community rally around stopping a bill that a lot of the civil rights groups had significant concerns about, and organizations that serve the communities of color had concerns about over policing and how this was going to be used both to continue to over police certain communities, but also to monitor, surveil, and chill free speech and protests.
Yeah. So, I mean, you explained a lot there. I mean, essentially, this drone bill was introduced. I think as long as I was tracking it, there wasn't ever an explanation as to why the urgency for this bill. And then advocates and civil rights advocates were essentially saying, we don't understand the need or the rush. I think one of the things that we've discussed is like, anytime we introduce a criminal justice bill or civil rights bill or some sort of reform, it's always like a work group or rushing it. What are the unintended consequences? The extreme examples of how this may impact like some small percentage or how the law may be abused always gets used against us. But in this, I think advocates were clearly saying like, look, we don't understand the consequences of this. It's moving too fast. This is going to have a negative impact on our Fourth Amendment, which is based on reasonable expectations of privacy. We don't know if these checks will make sense because you don't know if violations have happened unless it happens after, in the context of usually a criminal case or some other civil case where you get discovery or something like that. And you find out that this stuff has been illegally, been recording data, whatever, people using it to create pretext kind of stuff. I don't know. Like you that abuse or misconduct is like very hard to ferret out, as they say, right? And so it was just completely baffling as to why so much energy was pushed in this bill. And I think even in the context of what's happening federally, like why on earth would we be expanding law enforcement footprint at this point with everything that's going on federally?
Yeah, and that's so the entire California situation was developing during the kind of the various different movements we've seen on the bill, and another reason of just like, is this like, why are we doing this? Why are we opening up additional police powers at this time? It's just, we should be going the other way. That's what's, I think, so frustrating. Not to go into the session at large, but it's been a tough session for civil rights, and then pro law enforcement bills have been making their way through the session pretty easily, and that's been frustrating considering what we're seeing at the federal level, and what you think Oregon generally stands for.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad it seems like it's finally gone. It took a lot of energy and effort. I think you had mentioned, over 1,000 people submitted testimony. I don't know how many emails went out, because this only tracks submitted testimony. And like you said, only handful of people were in favor of it. So, but it was a good turnout by the civil rights community, and an important stand that we took in order for this not to pass. And I feel like it's going to rear its ugly head at some point again in the future.
We'll be seeing it again, I'm sure.
Yeah. Julia, did you have any comment on this?
Nothing to add that hasn't been said. This bill was just completely bizarre. The timing of it with what we were seeing on the federal level, there was so much opposition, and then this insistence on trying to somehow sneak this through without being able to give any sort of explanation about what the need was for this bill. I find this just a completely bizarre bill. And I'm just so glad that the community came out in the way that it did to oppose this.
One other thing I just wanted to point out is the fact that like one group coming out against one of our, reform, modernization, just common sense bills can sink our bill. Here you have an entire civil rights community coming out, and we had to just continue to fight and fight and fight to get heard. And so that's, I think, just really sad and frustrating, because we see how easy it is for other certain groups or agencies to kill a bill that would do some real good. And then to see the effort on this was frustrating.
And it was strange to see how the civil rights experts would say, would provide concern or explanation based on their expertise that this is good. This has a lot of potential problems. And then to have people supportive of this who are not experts in the civil rights field saying, don't worry about it. And the proponents of it going with that expertise. And in the criminal justice space, when we as an organization come in and advocate for reforms, it's just so bizarre to me, like how people pick and choose whose voice is an expert voice to listen to, and it's all just sort of based off what end result they want to get.
Yeah, and the fact that we're required, our standard of proof, let's say, is significantly higher than law enforcement who come in and just say, no, I mean, yeah, maybe that could potentially happen, but we're not going to allow that to happen. And it's like, whoa, if we came in and said that, we'd be laughed out of the room. We have to come in with drawings and pictures and stats and databases and all sorts of different things just to
burdens.
Yeah, just all sorts of things we got to come in with. And here they are going like, just trust us, bro.
That is basically what they're saying. Well, nice work by the civil rights community. Hopefully, like I said, this is the last time we'll see it this session. I do feel like it's going to pop back up, but yeah, I think it's just an unfortunate thing that became something so important to a few of the legislators that they just wanted to push it for some reason. Yet it's the why is sort of lost on me at this point. But all right. Well, segueing into like another kind of big topic, in the past couple of weeks, our organization, we had been a part of the GIPA advisory panel convened by the governor in response to the GIPA report. And we spent a year and a half, 2 years, 6 staff members like on this advisory panel. And a couple of weeks ago, we announced that we were stepping off of it. So I was hoping, Julia, you could talk us through what happened and give us a little reminder of what the GIPA is, and then how we got on the advisory panel and what we were advocating for, I think, from the outset, and then why ultimately we made a decision as an organization to step off of it. But do you want to just give like a little bit of overview of what the GIPA was and what the findings of the GIPA were?
So in real brief on what the GIPA was, in 2022, the legislature directed the state to conduct a gender-informed practices assessment of Coffee Creek Correctional Facility. And this assessment was done by a team of out-of-state experts who have done these types of gender-informed practices assessments on other women's facilities in other states. And in 2023, the experts came out with their findings in what we call the GIPA report, and it was published in August of 2023. And the report provides findings based off of 12 different domains that they're looking at, and then it also includes an extensive list of recommendations. And what the GIPA report, I should back up a little, what they're looking at is that they're assessing Coffee Creek's adherence to gender-responsive, evidence-based, and trauma-informed principles in its policies and practices from admission into the prison to release. When the report is 228 pages, it's a very long report. It's not the easiest read, but when we read the report, what we feel like the report was saying is that Coffee Creek is deficient in sort of all areas, from admission to release, in terms of their practices, that their practices are not gender responsive, evidence-based, or trauma-informed. And it described a prison that is replete with dysfunction and dominated by a paramilitary and punitive culture. And the GIPA report identified countless harms that are happening to people, to the women that are incarcerated at Coffee Creek on a daily basis. The report also repeatedly stated that Coffee Creek reflects what they call, quote unquote, a traditional carceral approach. And so it's indicating that it operates a lot like a men's prison, and that there were certain aspects of Coffee Creek that the GIPA report termed not human-centered, and that they found dehumanizing and not appropriate for any justice-involved individuals. In response to the GIPA report, Governor Kotek, I think in a press statement, said that she found the report to be a sobering read. And so what she did was convened an advisory panel that is termed the Governor's GIPA Advisory Panel to take a look at the findings in the GIPA report and come up with recommendations about changes that need to happen in Coffee Creek. And the advisory panel was made up of advocates like us, program providers, formerly incarcerated individuals, and other experts. For example, Trauma Informed Oregon was part of this advisory panel. And the idea was that the advisory panel would meet, have discussions about the report, come up with recommendations, and put Oregon on a path to reforming Coffee Creek to mitigate a lot of the harms, or to reform it so that there are less harms going on in the prison.
Yeah, I mean, like when you read the GIPA report in totality, I think, as you alluded to, it basically, I mean, and this is like the really interesting thing, like people would just read sections of it and like hone in on sort of like this section, or, you know, what this section is. But if you really read it in total, what it says is Coffee Creek is essentially, it should not exist. Like it is not a place in which people can be held in custody in a way that's remotely healthy, because they talked about essentially everything, even to the built structure, as to how this is not adequate or responsive to the needs of women in any way. In fact, things are being exacerbated, people are being further harmed, traumatized, and this has always been sort of like the bizarre thing to me. Like after reading the GIPA report, I was just like, this place needs to be torn down. I mean, there's no way to actually fix it, you know, with these like piecemeal approaches that we're used to. And when the governor announced her advisory panel, this was the concern that we had, right? Like that. Well, when the legislature, the governor usually announces a task force or a work group, what is, Zach and Julia, what does that typically mean to you? I mean, for people who aren't sort of in the reform or policy world, what does that signal to you sort of at the outset, for the most part?
Usually when I hear that something's going to a task force, it seems like a way for the system or the state to say that they're addressing an issue without having to address the issue. And what we've seen with task forces is that people come together to talk about a problem, a report is written, and then it never gets addressed again.
Yeah, I would say, there are exceptions to the rule, but generally the rule is that it's to me, it's oftentimes a delay tactic, a way to get whatever is being talked about out of the news cycle, and a little bit further down the road to avoid having to take any substantive or actual steps to address the issue. And it's a really good way to do it because it takes a while to get the people together. It's, the task, whatever it is, the task for anything, advisory panel, it takes a while to get them together, and you have a meeting once a month. And so that's now 6 months down the line. You've only met 6 times. And you're now able to, sprinkle in a little bit of some leadership changes, and you have a recipe for being able to say that we've moved past the issues described in whatever report you're trying to address, or whatever issue you're trying to, or media or issue you're trying to address. And that's unfortunately generally the rule.
It's like enough times passed where the report is outdated because there have been some minimal changes or leadership change. Either the governors changed over, legislators have changed over. Basically you're just kind of, it's the perception of showing that you're doing something without doing anything. And it's
just the energy and interest in that issue area by the time the report's coming out a year later has maybe gone away. But with this GIPA advisory panel, we went into it knowing how these task forces or advisory groups can play out. But I think also seeing this as maybe an opportunity to be that exception that you mentioned, Zach. And so there was a sincere interest when we started, although we had some skepticism about what would come from this. We also went into this completely sincere and genuine, trying to push a conversation. What we felt like could happen by participating in this advisory panel is that there was a large group of people. A lot of times in these task forces, you see the same stakeholders in criminal justice related task forces. But here with the GIPA advisory panel, we had community organizations of advocates, formerly incarcerated individuals who could share their lived experiences, program providers who work with people in Coffee Creek on a regular basis, and just sort of a broader group of individuals and representing different organizations. And so at the very least, could we have a conversation and educate each other about what's really going on and what kind of changes need to happen and some ideas for changes that could possibly happen.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that was the open sort of eyes that the clarity that we went into this with, is knowing, and it's not to say, like you said, all work groups like this, there are exceptions. Like we were in a work group for Senate Bill 1008, we wrote a report. That report, we got a commitment from legislators to create a work group. We were part of that work group, and then out came 1008, which was productive. And there's other examples like this, but by and large, it is understanding this and then understanding the commitment. We didn't want to miss the opportunity. We wanted to be part of the whatever type of response, add our expertise, share sort of the knowledge that we had. And sincerely, we put 6 staff members on this basically, and hours, hundreds and hundreds of hours. But the irony of all of this, what is always so peculiar in a report like this, it basically tells you what needs to be done. So it's like you're creating a work group to study a report in which the legislature is asked to sort of essentially audit the prison and find out what needs to be changed. And then you put a task force basically to examine what needs to be changed and propose changes to what needs to be changed. I mean, it's kind of silly when you think about it.
There were certain parts of the way that it started out that sort of raised some question about why we were doing this. For example, the listening sessions that were held, and I wasn't at any of those. We had other staff there. It seemed like the turnout for the listening sessions with adults in custody at Coffee Creek was pretty low, and but that was really held up as something positive that was happening. But at the same time, to your point, Bobbin, these are the folks who had just been interviewed and filled out questionnaires and had just gone through the audit. And so it was unclear why there were so many listening sessions. And it almost at sometimes seemed like they were doing these listening sessions sort of separate from the idea that this assessment, this sort of comprehensive assessment, had just come out.
Yeah. From the outset, one of the things as an organization we were advocating for was legislative changes. And the reason why is because for those who aren't super familiar with administrative law, like first, all executive agencies like the Department of Corrections are a creation of the legislature. They have to have like a statute that creates the agencies and then statutes that tell the agency what the responsibilities and mandates are. And then from those statutes, the agencies themselves, because they're deemed experts, create internal rules or what we call regulations. And they're essentially like a quasi-legislative kind of function, but the agency's done them. There's no legislative input or involvement. The legislators do what they call promulgate rules. These are internal policies. And again, the legislature says, for example, Department of Corrections, you shall maintain the safety and order of the prisons. Us, legislature, we don't exactly know what that means because you're the experts. Therefore, we give the authority to promulgate rules in order to effectuate this mandate. The agency then goes and creates internal policies through an administrative process called rules. And they basically create a whole, body of rules and policies that essentially interpret that mandate. And this is largely how the Department of Corrections operates. There's these very broad statutes the legislature has given to the Department of Corrections. The Department of Corrections on its own is sort of managing the institution without any external sort of oversight or external sort of expertise or accountability. So we thought this was a problem. So I don't know, Julia, do you want to talk about kind of the things that we were advocating for sort of at the outset and what we thought needed to happen now 40, 50 years after the creation of the Department of Corrections by statute?
Early on, through the staff that was on the advisory panel and went to, maybe I should back up a little bit. When the advisory panel first came together, there were, I think, monthly meetings that the advisory panel would come together. And at those meetings, and I can probably share more about how those meetings went, because I think that's important in our decision for why we stepped off of the advisory panel. But from early on through our staff, we would talk about the need for statutes, that we have to have legislative mandates or legislative guidance to make the corrections that are needed at Coffee Creek. Because what we have seen is that without these statutes of guidance or mandates, this is how we ended up with this situation or the assessment that came out from the GIPA. And then we had a conversation with the governor's office directly, I think even on multiple occasions, asking about the governor's opinion or the governor's energy or interest in getting legislation ready for the 2025 session. And it was very clear that the governor's office, it was clear to us that the governor's office hadn't talked to their GIPA staff person about legislation, and that the intention was that there wasn't a clear intention of what they wanted to do with this advisory panel, but we were hoping that we could keep advocating for and pushing for statutory changes. Meanwhile, there were other organizations who participated in the advisory panel that we found out were also having conversations with the governor's staff about legislation, and the staff person, the GIPA staff person, was not saying no to legislation. So we thought maybe with enough time and discussion on this that we could get some legislation ready for the 2025 session. But without it, that's why we are where we are with the conditions at Coffee Creek.
Yeah, and to just like go back to like some other points we've made in other recordings, we've talked about how Department of Corrections is largely an agency without oversight, right? Because the legislature hasn't really engaged or involved itself in being prescriptive in what DOC should and shouldn't be doing. A lot of these statutes that govern the Department of Corrections were created back in the 1960s, 70s when DOC was created with these very broad kind of mandates, and for DOC to fill in the whole page, not just blanks, but the whole page as far as like how it's going to govern. And all they're doing is just using practices and policies that either they have developed over time through their own sort of experience or, copied from other corrections. But this is not like peer-reviewed science or, experts from other fields coming in and helping craft necessarily the policies. This is all like just corrections people just making policies largely based on their own experience. It reminds me a lot of like junk science and law enforcement. Like it's just something that they created because they can create, and they created it based on what they're doing, And so the need for legislation, I think, in this time in 2025 is hugely important. And I think everything that GIPA was saying basically screamed for the legislature to weigh in and to create some clear guidelines for the Department of Corrections, because part of the problem with GIPA was the agency culture and leadership. So the I think the most ridiculous part about all of this, the GIPA was an audit of the prisons at Coffee Creek, and the very people who are responsible with overseeing the prison, managing Coffee Creek, were then put in charge by the governor to fix the problems that they were managing. I don't know.
It never made sense from the beginning as we saw this unfolding. And I think that's something that came up a lot for our staff when we would be, preparing for meetings or thinking through recommendations or preparing for the work groups, is this big question of why is it that the agency who's responsible for this problem is being relied upon to fix this problem. And not only that, but the Oregon Department of Corrections has a history of not being able to implement any policy reforms. I think nobody really talks about the Oregon Way anymore since Director Colette Peters left, but there was a lot of money and funding that went into this concept of the Oregon Way, which was supposed to humanize people who were incarcerated and to recognize that reforms had to be made in the prison because these were going to be our neighbors in the broader community once they were released. And now you don't hear anything about the Oregon Way, and nothing really was implemented over all those years when the Department of Corrections was talking about, trust us, we're implementing the Oregon Way reforms.
Which again reinforces the need for statutory mandates, because right now the rulemaking like the rules and the policy, like the internal practices, are largely governed or dictated by swings in corrections culture, leadership. You could have like a superintendent at one prison that wants to do something one way, but the superintendents don't and may actually implement some positive changes, but they don't stay at the prisons for more than a few years anyway before they get transferred, promoted, or whatever. Then they're gone and all that work is done. Same with the head of the Department of Corrections. I mean, Mike Reese is there, and Kyle Black, our policy associate, tried to make this point over and over again. And he may be trying and he may be like sincere about bringing changes. But one, there's not really any mandate for corrections level, like staff level at the prisons to actually implement this stuff. There's no real accountability if they don't. And then secondly, he's going to leave soon anyway. I mean, he's already retired from 2 other public official jobs. I'm sure retirement has to be somewhere, in the near horizon for him again. But then when he goes, I mean, like, who knows what's happened? So statutes allow for more consistency of practice, at least an accountability measure, perhaps. So you said you were going to talk a little bit about the meetings more. Can you talk a little bit more about, what were the meetings, like the different types of meetings that you had, how much like staff time went into it, and how much we contributed and what we brought to those meetings.
So the meetings, I believe, were once a month, and there were these general GIPA advisory panel meetings, which were largely, and they're still going on today, but it is Department of Corrections staff or Coffee Creek staff providing presentations of information from their perspective and point of view about how things are going at Coffee Creek or what efforts DOC is making. And then it's one person presents and then another DOC person presents. And there was really no space or time for the advisory panel people to have any discussion or to provide really any advising to the Department of Corrections. And those were the general meetings. Not long after the advisory panel was created, there were what were topical work groups that broke out from the advisory panel. And there were people who were not on the advisory panel, but who were community members that were brought in to work on these work groups. So there was a work group on maintaining family connections. There was a work group on facilities and operations, a work group on survivors of domestic violence who are incarcerated. Just these different topics that the advisory panel members wanted to have work groups on to come up with recommendations. That's where we brought on more staff to participate in these work groups. This is where I think we felt like at least we could have some conversation and maybe come up with additional recommendations than what was in the GIPA advisory panel. And if we could get the governor's office to understand that we needed to, or the governor herself to back legislation, we would have recommendations sort of ready that could be converted into legislation for the 2025 session. Depending on the work group that you were in, the response from the Department of Corrections could be very different. Sometimes you would have Department of Corrections staff in the work group that were very knowledgeable about that work group. I heard positive things from our policy associate, Kyle Black, who was on the reentry work group, about the DOC and Coffee Creek staff were there that really at least understood what was going on with reentry planning for people before they got released. And we were on the facilities and operations work group, and there were DOC staff in there that understood sort of the day-to-day of certain things that was really helpful in coming up with recommendations. But then we were on a work group that was around access to the courts and the law libraries, and there wasn't anyone from DOC that could really speak to or understand what was going on for adults in custody when they were trying to access the courts. And in some ways, it was trying to educate that person about what was happening. And then eventually that person from DOC stopped coming to those work groups. From those work groups, recommendations were drafted. The work groups that finished up early, there were sort of more formalized documents of recommendations that I believe went to the advisory panel for discussion and to potentially approve of the work group recommendations. But as time went on and the work groups were not finishing up, at a certain point, whatever was drafted as recommendations got put into this huge Excel sheet. And we on the work group didn't know that this was happening, but it just got sent over to the Department of Corrections. And for the Department of Corrections to decide which of these, for each line item, not even really having the context for the recommendation, deciding whether or not they were going to do it or not do it, or look into it or consider it. And that was sort of the end of the work groups and the recommendations.
And then what happened after that?
What happened after that in terms of the advisory panel or?
Yeah, the advisory panel, because I'm going to come back and ask you about 1120 in just a second.
What happened after that? The work group stopped meeting and the advisory panel monthly meetings continued on. And what happened after that? Nothing that I could tell from being on the advisory panel. Nothing happened from that. We just kept meeting on a monthly basis, and DOC would give their presentations, and sometimes people would comment, mainly people from our staff, and then we would just wait for the next meeting.
All right. And so along the way, as an organization, we decided, because it made very clear, because the governor made clear to us that legislation was off the table, that she wasn't interested in supporting it.
It actually wasn't very clear from the beginning, and this is where
well, not at the beginning, but pretty early on.
It was a little confusing because the information that we were getting was that the governor hadn't given a very clear okay for legislation. But when this other organization was talking about how do we start, educating and talking to legislators, getting them ready for legislation in 2025, there was no signal to them that they shouldn't be concerned about that because the governor wasn't going to back legislation. So there was always, maybe naively from my side, thinking, okay, maybe there can be some sort of something. Maybe we can, if it's not just us saying it, other organizations are pushing for legislation. At some point, this is going to break our way and we can get the governor to back some kind of legislation that's responsive to the GIPA. What we saw at the same time going on is the Department of Corrections put together their GIPA POP, which is a policy option package that is maybe Zach can describe this better. It's like a funding package or budget request for a specific issue area. In this place, it would be GIPA, and it's separate from the agency's full budget. And the Department of Corrections put together their GIPA POP, and it's talked about as if the advisory panel had some sort of say in this. This GIPA POP went out to the advisory panel members. I don't think people really even understood what this is. To understand what a policy option package is, you have to have some understanding of how the legislature and the budgeting process works. What we saw in the GIPA POP were just a lot of positions. For Department of Corrections at some of them not even specifically at Coffee Creek, or it was unclear. And then some smaller line item things that were things like Werner journals, and either tablets or the chargers for the tablets or something like that. These things that just did not seem really responsive to how much change really needed to happen at Coffee Creek for there to be any meaningful outcomes from the GIPA report. So that was going on. So the Department of Corrections sees that as like their legislative thing, that they were intentional about wanting to do something through the legislature on the GIPA, but it was this policy option package.
Yeah, and apparently the governor, in her quotes in the Oregonian, talked about how the POP was the response, basically. And so let me get this straight. So you have this work group that's going on. You have recommendations going in which DOC sort of behind the scenes is making decisions without discussions with the work group about what they think they want to implement, what they don't, they're accepting, rejecting kind of thing. At some point, legislation, it was confusing because legislation was on the table and then it basically wasn't on the table. So there was not any intention to have a legislative response. Then
that's actually where it gets unclear too, because, and maybe Zach can speak to this. So some of the organizations that were on the GIPA advisory panel came together to meet with the governor's office with Mia Rustin, the gender responsive policy analyst that was running the GIPA initiative from the governor's office, and the public safety advisor, which was Constantine at first and then became Valerie Polis. And there were efforts around that. And it could be helpful to hear from Zach about that, because that was all brought together and there was meetings to try to get the governor to back legislation. And the governor's office showed up at those meetings, and maybe Zach can fill in what happened there.
Well, the governor didn't show up herself to the meetings. But the governor's office, there was discussions about, we've always maintained that legislation's needed here. Just as a quick aside, like in no other field is it like appropriate to just allow the arbiters of everything to just decide like what's going to be allowable and not, like just to give them complete free reign to just promulgate rules that they can change whenever they want and not follow and not have any repercussions for, or internal policies or written whatever they want to call them. Like the legislature steps in and says, this is unacceptable. Here's how we're going to fix it. Here's what you're going to do. And yet, like magically, that never happens to the Department of Corrections. But anyway, so it's always been clear to us that legislation was needed, and there were a lot of things that need to be fixed from the GIPA report, right? That need to be addressed, and we'll talk about it later. But we put together a bill that does that. But so in the conversations, it quickly got down to like, it seemed like the governor was potentially not necessarily looking forward to really supporting anything, but was willing to see what we could come up with. And so it ultimately, the coalition in support of it, which was like a coalition spun out of the advisory panel, out of kind of just a little bit, not a little bit, frustration that we weren't getting anywhere on legislation fixes, put together an idea to reform the corrections ombuds office, or position. It's not really an office at this point. We were trying to make it an office, and the advisors they seem to jump at that, and so we were like, all right, well, we can throw together. We'd already been kind of working on some ideas and stuff like that, and I think the ombudsman was just about to be fired, essentially, the one at the time. Anyway, so we put together some stuff. There were a lot of delays in it. Working in a coalition sometimes is just slower than you would like, but also the governor's office would then, we wanted to keep them involved so that they felt invested, so that they would hope that hopefully they would gain the governor's support for the bill. Keep in mind that, like, as currently constructed, like, it is under the governor's purview, the corrections ombud. So it's not like we're asking for anything special here. It's just to help change a position or an office under your authority, governor. So we eventually got it in. It was, later in the pre-session than I would have liked, but ultimately got in. And we heard essentially that the governor appreciates the work on it, but that we were told we were not going to get the governor's support on it. And so, which was frustrating, incredibly frustrating, but also just showed, I think, the level of just disinterest from the governor, that even when we kind of, and this is a position that's had issues, right? It's had the first corrections ombuds that was appointed was very vocal and public about his frustrations with the position and the constraints that were being put on him by DOC, the governor's office, the DOJ, and so on. And so it was known that, like, there needs to be some changes here, and then also another office that could potentially help with making sure that anything implemented either at the legislature or even in rule, by rule, could be overseen and they could be held accountable. And I just think that there is a complete disinterest in any accountability, and that eventually just got the governor to not support the bill. And it's a tough lift of a bill. I mean, it's gonna require funding. It's gonna require some nuances and maneuvering around DOC on it. And to do that, we really could have used the help from the governor's office. So,
and keep in mind that while these efforts are happening, it's not as if Coffee Creek is getting better on its own. So the GIPA report was published in August of 2023. We're making these asks, as well as other organizations, for legislative changes. We're in the work group. The organizations that were part of this ombudsperson reform put in a lot of hours trying to put together like a very solid proposal for legislation. During this time, Coffee Creek is experiencing an incredible amount of lockdowns, which is or adults in custody there are being confined to their cells, confined to the day room. It's having a very detrimental impact on people's welfare. Visiting is being shut down. People are not getting outside for yard time. That's being shut down. There's still allegations of harassment and assault happening that's all coming out through the media, that was going on. This is all available to the governor to see. So in my mind, at the very least, when this ombudsperson reform legislation comes around, you are now over a year past the GIPA report coming out, and things at Coffee Creek arguably getting worse than when the GIPA people came in to do their assessment. So to back legislation that would at least provide some sort of oversight or to this department that is getting worse since the report came out, I felt like was the very least that she could have done. The other thing, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I mean, there was just, I think to me that's such a glaring thing that was happening. In addition to that, the reports were coming out about how the medical services in Coffee Creek was really deficient. And I don't know the timing of the final ombudsperson reform, the policy coming together, but there was lots of conversation about how people's medical care and medical needs were really not being met. And there was so much dysfunction in Coffee Creek in medical services. So it has not been an improvement just on its own since the GIPA report came out. And arguably, when I talked to people inside, I talked to people who had left Coffee Creek in 2021, 2022, and now they're back in Coffee Creek. They cannot believe how bad things have gotten. This is not the prison that they left just a few years ago. So I think that's an important thing to point out, is things are in a lot of respects worse than when the GIPA report came out.
So we have about like 10 minutes, and I know this is really important to have opened up sort of like what had happened, because this is all to the point of like why we ended up stepping off. But we did introduce Senate Bill 1120. Do you want to talk a little bit about why we did that while we were part of the GIPA advisory panel?
We wanted to show that you could put together legislation that was based off of the recommendations either in the GIPA report or from that came out through the work group. That there was some sort of, I don't know how strong of a narrative it was, but that legislation was such a big, bold move and would be very complicated and difficult to do, which was always very confusing or baffling to me, because Governor Kotek was the Speaker of the House for a long time. I mean, if anybody knows how the legislature works and how legislation can be proposed and moved, it would be Governor Kotek. And so when people from her office were suggesting that legislation is too complicated, we wanted to be able to show that you can do it. You can put forward these concepts into legislation, and with the backing from the governor's office, you're just more likely to move them.
Mm-hmm. And it was introduced in the Senate Judiciary. We had testimony, so you could see testimony for that. Really powerful testimony by our staff. And to the Senate Judiciary's credit, they passed it out of the policy committee and put it into Ways and Means. So it was basically the Senate Judiciary saying, on the substantive or policy perspective, they said this was important enough for them as a signal to move. Like, they agreed in principle that things need to change. They were all aware, like the financial resources to implement what we put in 1120 were extraordinary, and that it wouldn't likely make it out of the financial committee or the Ways and Means committee. So for them, it was like a symbolic gesture, I think, that a really powerful one. And there were some nice comments from some of the senators during that conversation.
And I think one of the comments made by Przanski was pretty encouraging in this, with the idea that he commented that he was thinking about putting this into a work group. But after the testimony that was given about 1120, it was clear that there's already been a lot of conversations around these recommendations, that there's been a GIPA assessment with experts making recommendations. There have been advisory panel meetings. There have been work groups with countless meetings on this. And that's where these concepts came from. And to just recognize that creating a work group turning 1120 into a work group would have just been kicking it down the road for something that has already gone through so much conversation. And so that was there was something validating to hear about that. And I believe one of the other senators commented about how the legislature has not stepped up to address this, and that there needs to be more guidance provided by the legislature to the Department of Corrections.
And at a fundamental level, I mean, this was one of our goals this session, was to push this idea that the legislature needs to engage more in DOC and helping shape, provide mandates, guidelines and stuff like that for the agency. So from that perspective, I think we opened up that conversation, and we'll continue to push on it. But then you fast forward just to the next week, and they said the Judiciary Committee's invited the Department of Corrections to come in and talk about both issues related to medical, and a separate hearing talk about the GIPA. They came in, did a presentation on the GIPA, and here we saw sort of like this tendency of the legislature to fall back, and I think a lot of it's sort of old practices, which is highly deferential to the agency, asking a lot of questions, in part because the legislators don't have a depth of understanding of what's going on in the Department of Corrections. The Department of Corrections basically doing a dog and pony show, putting up graphics, putting up information like slides with pictures of like new, what is it, dashboards and charts and spreadsheets, and basically that kind of stuff just kind of washes over, and people just say, okay, it looks like you're doing something. We're presented with all this flashy and fancy stuff. While we hear is like there's sub work groups, accountability, dashboard, work groups, accountability, task boards, dashboards, like, you just kind of hear those things over and over again. And at the end of the day, legislature is fine. It looks like DOC is doing something. But if you actually like interrogate anything that they're presenting, what you find is it's just like people pushing sand around on a beach. Like there's nothing really happening,
What it sort of came down to sort of the final activities that we were involved with that led us to understand that we needed to just step off, not only because it wasn't a good use of our organizational staff time and resources, but also we had to step off to make some sort of statement that this was not okay. Like this response is not something that should continue. And maybe by somebody like our organization saying, we're not going to participate in this anymore, could at least give some resistance to this busy nothingness that's been going on for 2 years. After the recommendations were given to DOC, DOC is deciding what it is or isn't going to do. Apparently, there are all these dashboards. GIPA has its own page with menus and things you can click on, and there's dashboards of recommendations and timelines and teams of meetings. We were also asked to be on implementation work groups. And so there's maybe 2 advisory panel organizations represented on these implementation work groups, and then DOC or Coffee Creek staff on them. And when our staff person started on the implementation work group for operations, it was very clear that, or it seemed clear that we were sort of starting all over again, because our staff person was left to explain to Department of Corrections and Coffee Creek staff on the implementation work group what the recommendations were. And those administrative people were not even aware of the current situations or things going on into Coffee Creek to understand why those recommendations were made in the first place. And so now we're 2 years later, still trying to convince Department of Corrections about what recommendations to implement. They're still trying to get a background on why these recommendations are happening. And we haven't even gotten into we're not even at the point of the decision to implement these things. We're still in a conversation about DOC deciding whether or not to implement something. Once they decide to implement something, when it's something punitive, they can make the changes very quickly. When it is something that is reform-based, it takes a very insanely long time for things to happen. One prime example was, one of the things the women had asked for is to not have to tuck their shirts in when they're in the day room. That policy change, internal policy change, did not happen, I think, for something like 6 or 9 months for them to officially allow people to not tuck their shirts in during the day room. I mean, so after that experience with our staff being in the implementation work groups, there was a lot that we had to say about, we had to really think, how long are we going to participate in this? Additionally, in recent advisory panel meetings that I was in and our staff members were in, and that's the thing about our staff, we showed up at, I want to say, every advisory panel meeting there was, every work group that we were a part of. The recent advisory panel presentations from the Department of Corrections was about how DOC is messaging that GIPA and GIPA reforms are not special treatment, and they are sort of proud of the posters or the visual messages that they're giving to corrections officers and staff in Coffee Creek about the importance of GIPA and why reforms are not special treatment, but appropriate or proper care for women and adults in custody at Coffee Creek. And we're 2 years later, and this is what is happening internally at Coffee Creek. And one of the staff people reported about how DOC now has something called a Team 2, and that the staff people that are part of this Team 2 talked about how proud they are. Their Team 2, they're branded. They feel like they have a brand recognition in Coffee Creek. The staff person couldn't explain what Team 2 did, but they were very excited about this Team 2. And it just was looking like, now that the legislative effort had come and gone and the opportunity there had passed, it was unclear why we would stay in this and why we would not speak out against this very superficial process that was happening. The other thing that came out is that the new superintendent at Coffee Creek, I believe she's recently started, is Charlotte Thrasher, who came from the Washington. She was a superintendent at a women's prison in Washington State. And during the GIPA informational meeting before the legislature, the Director Reese said that Charlotte is somebody who has been, I believe he used the language, successful when it comes to implementing gender responsive practices in Coffee Creek, in the women's prison in Washington, that she's familiar with this and she's been successful. Earlier this month, there was a report that came out from the Washington Corrections Ombudsperson Office that highlighted some very brutal and inhumane treatment of adults in custody at that very women's prison that Charlotte was the superintendent at, for adults in custody in their, forget what they term it, but it's basically their segregation unit. And that the superintendent at that time, who was Charlotte Thrasher, was specifically named in some of the policy, Department of Corrections policy violations.
Lastly, what I would like to emphasize is the way that we were treated. As the executive director of OJRC, what I saw, and this goes back even highlighted with the drone bill, the asymmetry that exists between like civil rights groups and law enforcement or agencies. It's the idea that we came and showed up, I think, sincere, willing to share like our expertise and knowledge with a real hope that we could engage in some meaningful conversation about real change. And a lot of this was like, again, DOC just basically, like, what you're talking about, Zach, it's just like they just had carte blanche to basically do whatever and say whatever they're going to do and implement whatever they wanted, which is a weird thing when the people responsible for it get to decide in their own entire discretion what it is they want to change and not change. But what came to light too was throughout the process, not what came to light, but throughout the process, what I'll say is our staff was regularly confronted with a condescending attitude, dismissive attitude. There are some people who were engaging and like wanting to, talk with our staff members to really gain insight. But there were a number of DOC officials that were like very skeptical and cynical about our involvement, and you could feel that. They were condescending and dismissive of the things that we were bringing to the table. I think the governor's office, I think generally speaking, was dismissive of like the legislative solution that we were trying to push from the outset. So that felt like they weren't real serious. And then also it came to our attention that the Department of Corrections and administrators at the Coffee Creek were blaming us for the inability for the Department of Corrections to pass its POP or blocking other reforms or changes that they were trying to implement. And what really happened is the POP we had nothing to do with. That was just DOC and the legislature. I mean, to think like some organization like ours can derail a funding request from an organization, a multi-billion-dollar agency, is a little silly and sort of gives us a lot of credit. We can do things, but I don't know that we can actually impact a pop of an agency, especially because we never really said or did anything and against it. We never spoke to it or really publicly made any comments or thoughts about it. We just thought it was a ridiculous thing to begin with. But then I think the reforms, they were blaming us for not being able to implement changes. But partly what was happening is they would propose some changes or identify some changes or potential changes, and we'd review those changes and share with them constructive feedback about the problems with those changes and why this could actually create more problems. And they interpreted that as us blocking reforms they wanted to implement. Now, technically speaking, maybe that's what it is, that we were highlighting the problems with the things that they were doing, which prevented them from implementing those things and causing those problems. But to say that we were somehow obstructing change and communicating that to the AICs that we work with at Coffee Creek, that's where it sort of just was the last line, because we go in, we work, we provide legal services, we advocate on behalf of the women there. For the administrators there then to sort of admonish our organization and talk sort of disrespectfully about it to people who we have to have these sort of relationships with was just too far. So ultimately, we made the decision to walk off from this. And, you know, this can do whatever it's going to do, but we will find other ways to kind of advocate and try to hold the agency accountable for the GIPA, you know. So all in all, very disappointing. I think what's very clear is that Governor Kotek does not care about people in prison, does not care about how they're treated, does not care about the violations of rights, the indignities that they suffer. She's too deferential to the Department of Corrections. I don't think she has any understanding of like what's going on, to be honest. I mean, that sort of all sort of played out. I mean, that the only way you could describe the actions that have transpired since the GIPA is as if someone like that existed or was in charge of it, which is really unfortunate. And here we are. So yeah, so that was like I think a good walkthrough of why we walked off the GIPA committee. We'll try to make sure the link to the letter that Julia wrote to the governor's office and the Department of Corrections is available. So if you're interested, but any last thoughts, Zach or Julia, before we sign off for today?
I guess my last thought is just this all could have been avoided if the governor just treated the GIPA as the legislature asking independent investigators or, you know, independent organization to come in and review. If they just took that as the recommendations and they convened a group to come up with a legislative plan specifically of how to implement, because it's a lot of work. We know we put the bill together on our own. If she had just done that, and then there was a plan to say, okay, this chunk we can get through in this session, the next long session, this is the chunk, and then that's what she could have presented to the community, to Oregonians, and say, here's what we're doing to address these great, you know, these issues that, you know, the sober read as she described the report. It's frustrating because it could have been avoided if there was just that, but if there was that intent there, and clearly there isn't, to your point, Bob. And so anyway, that easily could have been done, and we would have been passing legislation, you know, with the support of DOC, the governor, and, you know, improving the lives of people who are literally held in custody by the state that is depriving them of these rights. So.
Well, I just, Julia, you wanted to say something?
Well, I just think the final thing I would say is just to reiterate a little bit what we talked about before, which is that I feel like we had to step off because we are in the position where there's a lot of different reasons why people would stay on the advisory panel, and to be able to hear what's going on and to continue to be a part of that. Those reasons are not something that that we rely on. And so for us, it just got to the point where by continuing to participate in their efforts and them coming to us and asking us to continue to participate was us sort of condoning what was going on, for us to condone and say that we agree with the sort of just process and discussion and talk without ever seeing any plan for real change. And stepping off the advisory panel was at least some sort of resistance to this continued effort to not make any changes and to continue to treat people who are in custody as if they are not worthy of these very basic human rights or human care, which is what the GIPA assessment said was not going on in Coffee Creek, that there's not a human-centered approach in a lot of ways in the way Coffee Creek is functioning.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, we could talk hours for this, to be honest, about all the dynamics and the substance of the GIPA and like what needs, like, you know, sort of like the state's response to all of this and just generally to people in prison. But Julie, I just want to thank you and your team for all the effort and energy and the hundreds of hours that you put into this. I mean, all of you brought not only thoughts, constructive sort of reforms and changes, researched ideas, lived experiences, professional experiences, you know, all to the table, all largely to be just sort of dismissed and ignored, you know, and watered down. So I know it was like a challenging experience having to engage in those dynamics, but I really appreciate everything your team did over the past 2 years. And now we move forward and try to figure out a different path forward. Yeah. Well, thanks for listening. This has been another episode of Trailblazing Justice. We'll be back next week. Like I said, we'll hopefully follow up with our solitary conversation. We'll have Steve Wax back on to talk about the stuff that's going on federally. And we'll probably be back with our core podcast crew of Zach and Julia and Mark to talk about some other criminal justice issues that we're working on. Thanks for listening. See you next week.